Here we go. This is the May roundup. I read quite a lot in May. Sadly, almost all of it was for university. I have to admit, I'm feeling sad. So a long time ago, the first time I went to university, one of the teachers said to me that studying English literature, there is a very high likelihood that it will kill your love of literature through 4 years of studying it and writing essays about it. And I never believed her, not me. I thought, you must have a weak constitution if studying literature just destroys your love of it. And here I am in my second semester and I feel it. These books that I have to read are really getting to me. Well, let's just talk about the books that I read in May, huh? Patrick Hamilton, The Slaves of Solitude, best book of May. I'll tell you right now. I enjoyed this quite a lot. More than I thought I would. The novel took quite a big twist towards the middle. When her friend Vicky comes to live at the same rooming house as poor Mrs. Roach, the novel gets really incredible. And I'm waiting to hear back from some of your comments. A lot of people said that they were going to read this one. When you do, let me know what you think, because I enjoyed this one a lot. So there was the highlight of May. So it's all downhill from here. J.M. Coetzee, Foe. This one hurts me a little bit because I've read 2 novels by Coetzee. Love them both. Succinct, brilliant, psychological writing. And this, I just don't feel I got it. This novel, Foe, is based on the story of Robinson Crusoe, the man who's he's a castaway and he's on this uninhabited island where there's Robinson Crusoe and then there's his man Friday. And in this novel, a woman comes ashore onto this island and she forms the third part of this trio. And they are rescued and they are taken back to England, and she is telling her story to Daniel Defoe. Daniel Defoe? Is that right? Isn't that the actor? So she is going to tell her story of being a castaway and how they survived there. Now, I haven't read Robinson Crusoe, which is a problem because I'm missing quite a large piece of the puzzle to understand this. I don't understand what's happening. It's very confusing and complicated and I just didn't get it. I'll try it again because I really have a lot of faith in Coetzee. This one was over my head. Now we're going to get into my reading list. Dear Current Occupant by Shalene Knight. It was very hard for me to enjoy. Let's put it that way. I had a very hard time with this book, especially because of something that takes place in the prologue. On page 2, she says, my mother was a sex worker and my mother was using drugs, not quite a junkie, but drugs were a part of my mother's life. The story of Dear Current Occupant is Shalene Knight going to revisit all of the very cheap, little, ugly apartments that she lived in when she was a child, and her mother was very irresponsible and her father was absent. And they had to move quite a lot because of not having rent and because of trouble with her mother's manner of getting money. She gives you some snapshots of what her life was like. Very short chapters. Here is the address. We lived here. I made friends with one of the neighbors, or I would go to school down the street. That's okay. It's just that the prologue, she says to the reader these harrowing details about her childhood that nobody would wish to have or to experience. But then at the end of the prologue, she says, but you should not feel sorry for me. That is not the purpose of this book. With all due respect, you being the author, I think that is the purpose of this book, that we should feel sorry for you. And we know, because we have your work in our hands, that there is a happy ending. You grew up, you received some kind of an education, and you fulfilled what we can imagine must have been your dream to become a published author. So I find it a bit disingenuous for you to tell me, don't feel sorry for me. I will. And I think that is entirely appropriate with this narrative. We don't even get very much of that. We don't get, there's no action. It's just, we lived here for a short amount of time. I was a skinny little girl with a lot of hair. Like, that is the majority of Dear Current Occupant. There's none of the dangerous stuff. I don't know if she is omitting it or if it was too painful for her to write, or she wanted to focus on the little girl's perspective. We lived here for a couple of months and then we moved over to here. I'll save this one for the end, but that's what came next chronologically. Twelfth Night by Shakespeare. I talked about this one last week. I guess I can say quite safely that is my favorite comedy. How to Pronounce Knife. It was very good for a while, and then it wasn't. The first story, How to Pronounce Knife, great. It's about a little girl who realizes that her parents, who are refugees from Laos, can't speak English, and she asks her father, how do you say this word? And he says it's knife. He can't pronounce it, and he tells her incorrectly, and then she goes to school and she's embarrassed by this. Good, nice immigrant story, but quite the usual sort of thing. Paris, the second story in the collection, about a Lao refugee working in a factory who thinks that her life will be better if she gets a nose job. I think it culminated with the fourth story in the collection, Randy Travis. That was really quite a good story. But a family of refugees from Laos learning to live their new Canadian life. Have you picked up on the trend in these stories? All 14 of these stories are very, very similar. Almost the same. Lao refugees in Canada trying to adjust to their new environment. Every single story. Most often with the main character being a young girl looking at her parents, seeing how they are trying to adjust to their new Canadian life as she tries to adjust to her new Canadian life. Every story over and over. And when all of the short stories are based on almost the exact same premise, it's annoying. It's very annoying. These stories are all interchangeable. They're all exceptionally similar. And I was reading some online reviews and a lot of people had the same criticism. I read this book a couple of days ago. I just finished it and I'm sitting down to write my review and I can't remember a thing about it. It's okay, but it's very disposable. And that's one of my criticisms of modern literature. It's not as meaty as the old stuff. It doesn't have enough the guts, the real, the blood and the sinews that are really in a real short story. Do what I did. Get it from the library, read a couple, take it back. Fugitive Pieces by Anne Michaels. So I read this book shortly after it was published in 1996. I thought it was a very intellectual piece of literature. Not quite my style. It's very unfashionable to say, but one of my favorite writers is Henry Miller. He didn't have any education that I know of. He just had this nearly insane passion to write. Another writer that I've only read 2 of his novels, but one of them made a drastic impression on me, Last Exit to Brooklyn by Hubert Selby Jr. And I know he had no education because he ran off to join the Navy at 15 or 16 years old. And then when he was 18 years old, he got pulled off the boat he was working on in Germany to have one of his lungs removed. He went to live in New York City where he was hanging around with the writers, and that was his education. Talking to the writers and asking them, how'd you do it? Last Exit to Brooklyn. That novel scares the shit out of me, and everybody should read it. Like this, it's a very intellectual novel. For my taste, it's a bit too fancy. Some people say, oh, it's so beautiful. And I would not entirely agree with that. I would say that this is very ornate. There is a very affected tone, especially in the second half of the novel. The second half of the novel, there were just so many of these beautiful lines that kept jumping off the page and like biting my eyes that it really started to piss me off towards the end. And I could open it up anywhere and there's one of those beautiful lines. If it is possible to speak without opening your mouth, without making a sound or altering the muscles in your face, that is how my parents look. Really. You listened, not like a priest who listens for sin, but like a sinner who listens for his own redemption. I could just see her rubbing her, saying, oh God, that's a beautiful line I just wrote. Oh my God. I complain about this all the time. I complained about it with Murakami. Just those beautiful lines like firecrackers. Oh, look, I wrote a beautiful line. And I knew I was standing on the bank watching while you, long escaped from dusty rock, lay between the wet thighs of the river. Fuck that. Fuck that. What is love at first sight? Here we go. What is love at first sight but the response of a soul crying out with sudden regret because it realizes it has never before been recognized. Stick that up your fucking ass, for Christ's sake. Like, would you climb down off of your altar and just write some simple sentences, please? We slept close, knowing we could not have such pleasure without such muteness. So that book pissed me off straight away because there were these three really impossible scenarios right at the beginning of the novel. The first one was there's this family in Poland and the Nazis came and killed them all because they were Jewish. But not Jacob, because Jacob was hiding in the walls. Somewhere, someone told people that in the past, old houses had passages between the walls and that the servants would go between the walls. And I think all people with creative minds kind of latched onto that, like, oh, in Europe, those walls, they have spaces between them. But no, it's not a common occurrence. Like, it's really, there were no spaces between the walls. I lived in Hungary. The walls were usually about 1/2 meter of solid concrete, heavy bricks with concrete poured atop of them. In the winter, it was cold. You had to have the heaters going. And in the summertime, it was also cold. That was a benefit. People could not hide in the walls. So the family's dead, and the child, we are told, is surviving alone in a forest, presumably by foraging. She never mentions what he eats. She writes that every day he digs a hole for himself, which he then covers himself, and he sleeps there to remain hidden. Now, if a child could do that, I imagine their life expectancy would be less than 24 hours. Because if you don't know it, Dan Michaels, the earth is cold. The child is going to die of hypothermia, sleeping in a pit. And foraging, like even a soldier or a very experienced hunter would have a hell of a time surviving by foraging. You would need traps for rabbits. You would need knives for skinning and gutting. You would need a fire to cook it. You can't tell me an 8-year-old child is living this way in the forest. It is showing the author's naivete. Digging in the forest is not like digging in your comfortable back garden in Toronto, where the soil is nice and black and loose and you can plant your asparagus. In a forest, the earth is as hard as iron because it is mostly rock, and what's not rock is tree root. And there's no soil to dig. It's mostly just the stuff that falls out of the trees, the leaves, the pine needles. That's what makes up the forest floor. It would take a grown man many hours with a pick and a shovel to dig a man-sized hole that he could lay down in and cover himself up. It is preposterous. So that was number 2. Don't give me that shit. But the worst one is yet to come. And these all happen within the first 50 pages. So that really pissed me off very quickly. A Greek man discovers the child, puts him in his car, and drives from this village in Poland to his island in Greece. The distance, it would take 24 hours driving today on our beautiful modern highways with our very friendly and manageable borders. But we are meant to believe that this man drove from Poland down through Slovakia and Hungary and Yugoslavia and Albania before getting into Greece, and that not one time anybody stopped him and said, "Get out of the car, I just want to search your car." Probably not for little Jewish boys, but cigarettes, alcohol. People weren't even allowed to drive cars because the petrol was so valuable. It was the Second World War. You just couldn't go on a little motoring holiday at the weekend. You would be stopped constantly, searched constantly. We should believe that an old man was allowed to drive the north to south length of Europe, and he was never stopped with a hidden little boy in the car. And maybe I'm nitpicking, but I think there is a high likelihood that people would say, "All right, stop the car. Where are you going? Going to Greece?" "Well, no, you're not going to go to Greece because we need your car. We are requisitioning your car because we need it for parts, we need the fuel, we need the spark plugs, we need the rubber tires, we need all of that. So get the fuck out of the car, and if you have any luggage, you'd better take it with you, and you're going to be walking to Greece." That's likely. What's not likely is driving from Poland to Greece with a child under a tarp. I know suspension of disbelief, and we might even have to consider this magic realism based on those very fantastical scenarios. But that, coupled with the very lofty and dramatic language, just killed me, this book. And really, after the events of the Second World War, the book is very boring. It's very boring. I think a lot of people are going to tell you how much they love this book, but they're not being very objectively critical. So that was the month of May. I've just really had enough of modern Canadian literature, and I've still got quite a few more to go. Modern Canadian literature is not very good. The main thing is, I'm a Lao refugee in Canada. What do I do? Who am I? I'm a half Chinese man in Canada. Who am I? What's my life? Is it Chinese? Is it Canadian? Another one, I'm a gay native Canadian. Oh, isn't that different? Am I Canadian? Am I native? Am I gay? What is it? Another one over here. I'm a bisexual native Canadian, but I'm really not Canadian because I'm more native than Canadian. Even though I live in a condo in Toronto, I'm still native. Canadians, can you not get over yourselves? Can't you stop just this obsessive navel gazing? It's depressing me, because one of the reasons I started this YouTube channel was because I wanted to highlight Canadian literature, but not this stuff. I meant the good stuff. Timothy Finlay, Robertson Davies, Margaret Lawrence, Ernest Buckler. Thank you for watching. This is Grant Loves Books. If you would like to support the channel, please check out my Patreon page, where I do even more bitching and complaining. All right, thank you for watching. Is it this side? Is it this side? I think it's on this side. No. But I wish the name of the book was How to Pronounce the Name of the Author, because I just can't tell you. That's too hard for me. I would like to know how many houses actually had spaces between the walls for servants. I don't think there would be more than a dozen. I would say there would be less than half a dozen. It was just some weird architectural spontaneity that somebody thought would be a good idea, and then they realized, no. You know, I mean, architecturally, it's a lot of work, and you've got to heat all the passages. It's completely nonsensical to have that just because you hate the sight of your servants. No, but